Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guests, sound designers Chris Battaglia and Chris Tehurne, join us to talk about their work on the TV show The Last of Us. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. So sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Chris B and Chris T. Hi guys, thank you for joining me. Today I've got a guest who both have the same first name, so we will refer to them as Chris T.
Hey, how's it going?
And we've also got Chris B.
Hi, how are you doing?
Thank you guys for joining me today to talk about The Last of Us. I'm really excited to sort of dive into a show that's kind of taking the internet and world by storm at the moment.
Well, thanks for waking up early to talk to us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
I'll happily get up any time to record a podcast, especially when you've got when it's something that I'm really excited to talk about and dive in. I was spending time at my work yesterday writing out questions, and hopefully I can add some more to those as well. I guess at the moment, how are you guys finding the reaction and reception for the show?
Pretty amazing. I catch myself actually talking to random people all the time about the show, and it's just like a virus that keeps spreading. It's funny because I just keep having these new perspectives on the show, and how people are feeling about certain characters, and and then I get to talk about, and that's just random without anyone knowing that I worked on the show, and then I get to kind of fold that into it, and it's been a really fun experience.
Yeah, I mean, same. It's been pretty amazing. We were both really excited to be working on it, and then we were like, oh, I think people are going to like this, but to actually have this huge reaction has been, I think, pretty, I don't know, it's like it feels really good, and it's also just pretty I don't think either of us expected it to blow up in the same way that it has.
Right. It feels like it would be, obviously the game had such a following, but for even like people that, I mean, I've talked to people that love the show and mention, oh, it's so rad how like it follows so true to the game, and then kind of it expands on character development that we never got in the game, and people like, it was a game. And so it's just funny to like see both sides of like, the fan base that is like they're hardcore, and then it brings in like this whole new fan base, and now people are like, now I got to play the game, and it's been pretty fun.
Do you ever have those moments where somebody's like, oh man, that show fucking sucks, like what are these people who are working on it doing? And then you kind of be like, I'm gonna step away from this conversation.
I've luckily not experienced those. With that, I know that those kinds of people exist, and I've experienced that on other projects, but on this one, honestly, the reaction has been so positive that I feel like it's been really lucky. We're really lucky and really fortunate that everybody, yes, it's similar to Chris Terhune, I've every single person I've talked to has just been over the moon excited, and or people are obsessed, and so just like want to know what happens in next week, and it's been really amazing to hear these audience reactions. And honestly, yeah, everything's been very positive, which also is just great.
I think having the episode release week by week has really kind of left audiences wanting more. I feel like that sort of water cooler talk about the show has really helped, instead of just sort of doing a Netflix model of it.
Yeah, well, that's what I always liked about HBO in general. Like they have that kind of old school like television vibe where you have to, you get something to talk about it, like the water cooler on a Monday morning. Like I remember that, like the last big show for me that was like that was just like everyone was so engaged, was like Breaking Bad. And I just remember every Monday, you just have your crew that you would just like obsess about what's going to happen next, or everyone's opinions. So I've always appreciated that HBO has kind of stuck to that weekly release as opposed to like a binging thing. And like binging has its time and place, but man, something like so cinematic and something that creates a culture, I feel like it wouldn't benefit as well if it was bingeable, because like how many times have you had a conversation with somebody that's bingeable? They're like, oh, have you watched this or that? And then you realize like you've gone further than one other person. So then the conversation just stops.
I gotta, no spoilers,
yeah, exactly. Oh, I haven't got that far. Oh, and it's like, okay, well, I guess we'll just move on. And it's like, Well, that's not fun.
Yeah,
So
I
I've
think
appreciated
that's
that about HBO.
I'm right there with you. I mean, I think the other part of that too is by releasing it weekly, it gives a lot more, or like it gives a lot of importance to each episode. And so like you sit there and you digest it and you talk about each episode as opposed to like talking about the entire season as a whole. And I think with like the full bingeable release model, like you end up talking about the whole season more complete. But like on this, I feel like it gives a lot of importance for each character and each moment and every scene. And I feel like it adds a lot of impact.
Yeah, and on top of that, what you're saying, no spoilers, the conversation goes on more. And I don't know, as you said as well, it's like something so cinematic, but it's so subject matter can be quite heavy in terms of what's happening on screen. So if you're binging that, then like watching whatever 8 hours straight of something like that, surely that would take a toll. But you would not appreciate what's going around you as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very true.
I've had some friends who are like, oh, I'm gonna binge it. I'm like, good luck. I mean, honestly, like I don't think it's a show based off of these characters and these stories. I mean, some of this stuff gets really heavy. I don't think I can like if I were watching this without having worked on it, I don't think I could just sit there and binge it because I need to take a moment, for some of these characters with some of these like these tragedies or these just very emotional scenes and these stories. So like, yeah, I also think that you're totally right, and that it adds to that.
Yeah, and just makes it more enjoyable. I think, as you said, if you're saying your friend's gonna binge watch it, it's like, yeah, you don't know what's gonna hit you in certain episodes, and you're gonna be like, you'll need to take a breather.
Well, and then you just kind of become numb to when you sit down and just kind of like drop everything around you and just like focus on 40 an hour or maybe hour and a half of content. Then it's like, cool, you can give it all your attention. But then it's like, oh, I'm just going to sit on the couch for 8 hours and binge something. It all kind of runs together. And then you kind of lose track and you have time to kind of like soak it in and think about it. So I think that's important too, because then you just become numb to a season. And then I feel like at that point, I mean, it could be good, but it's just, it doesn't hit you the same. Anyways, like, it's just I think I just love that old model of just weekly entertainment, and having the interactions with your friends or family and getting to talk about it, because that's kind of part of the entertainment. Like, it's to have buzz and talk about. So it's I again, like I like that HBO continues to do that.
Yeah, and I think one of the coolest things about the way this show in particular is airing is that video game adaptation, and full credit goes to Craig Mazin, the showrunner on this one, for writing and putting it together this way. But it's like, because it's that the adaptation from the game, it's you have a section of a story that would have been like a level or a that now is a single character story. You get to like focus on that, and it also lends itself to that week to week where you really get to enjoy this section and these people.
Yeah, and you have those. I think they have the episodes split out quite well in terms of who gets airtime and what sort of stories they're telling. You're not just following Joel and Ellie. Look at episode 3, for example, or even part of episode 5. Even though these two characters are the main characters, and you want to follow on their journey, it also gives you a glimpse of what other people's life is like during the apocalypse and how it's kind of turned for the better rather than, or in some cases, worse. So I guess to start from the beginning, how did the project come about, and who is responsible for what when creating the different soundscapes?
I think we're both just really big fans of the game. And so, I was brought on pretty early to start developing world and recording a lot of sounds, and recording a lot of like abandoned buildings and going out in the desert and recording scrap metal and things like that, because I knew we were going to get that material. And then we realized pretty early on the scope of work was just too big for a single sound designer. And so we really brought in Chris Terhune, who's just so good with creatures and so good with adapting IP to focus on the infected. And so I don't know, Chris, do you want to talk about that stuff?
I got brought in after Chris, once I think they realized the world is pretty big, and we just needed a pair of hands that can really separate two big food groups. And there's definitely some episodes where we both laid a lot of foundation in, but like, man, all credit goes to Chris, and for building that world and that apocalypse. And, you know, I got kind of reined in to just really focus on the infected with Craig Mazin. That was one thing he really wanted me to hone in on and make sure the clicker's right, make sure the bloaters are right, and, you know, the runners. And what does that sound like, you know, when it's not just your normal, I know it's not a zombie show, but it's just not your normal zombie sound. You know, what does it sound like when someone's really sick with, you know, pneumonia in their lungs, or whatever lung diseases and liquids and all that kind of stuff he really wanted to really dial in and focus on. And we spent so much time like recording and figuring out like what's too much, where do we toe the line as far as it sounding like a monster or sounding too Hollywood and too polished. And he really wanted to make sure it sounded as real as it can be. So I mean,
I think that was one of the coolest directions across the entire board, is like,
correct.
unlike a lot of television or even, you know, or feature films, we, like both Chris and I, the direction was make it grounded, make it real, make it detailed, because so much of this is so quiet, and there's actually so many opportunities for sound to shine in, because there's whole sections without music, you know, and they really are pushing sound forward. I think that's one of the coolest things that, I don't know, Chris Terhune got the direction on, which, you know, it's part of those conversations, but it was make them sound sick, you know, not a zombie. They're not monsters. They were sick. And so I don't know. I think you did such a good job of doing that.
Thank you. And definitely a lot of R&D on how to, because the hardest thing about adding fluid to a performance or lungs and stuff is making sure it feels connected and not doesn't feel like sound effects are on top of each other. So it was a lot of trying to figure out how to, you know, make it hand in glove and homogenous in a way where it didn't feel like a sound effect and it felt like just like a sick person. And it's obviously we're not going to go and you know, get people with pneumonia and stuff to come in the ADR booth and record stuff. So we had to kind of figure that out. And, you know, Craig and I spent a lot of time together just going down those roads and seeing what worked and what didn't. So that was a lot of fun.
I think one of the other big things about, just in general, about how the work got split up is we're both really big fans of the games, like big fans, and like those stories and those characters. And we really felt we wanted to do them justice. So I know we were both working really hard. You know, I was really like, well, we need to get the world right. You know,
that was kind of the first thing we really dove in on, is focusing, just because like the world is such a character itself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, every building had to creak, and making sure that every building sounded a little different from the other ones so that they didn't actually overlap. But also just being a big fan of the game. I mean, just doing the justice. I mean, Chris, clickers and bloaters, and I mean, these like the infected, the players and fans of this series already know what these sound like, but not in these contexts. You know, it's like it's gameplay is so different in terms of how the sounds translate than into television. And so like I know, like there's just so much work to be put in to make sure that every moment feels as impactful as it can, and that the familiar sounds sound familiar, but like that they're doing things that are new. And so making whole new kits of stuff that are able to actually translate to the screen.
When you have a show that's like, because this kind of leads to my next question as well about pre-existing source material, but when you have a show like this where it's quite interesting how you make one point crispy about this is going to be a show of a lot of empty buildings, a lot of creaking, a lot of those sort of, when you're walking around, it's like, did I hear that correctly? Is there something there, or is something going to collapse on me at any moment? But then with Chris T, it's quite interesting to hear about having to think about how somebody who has like a chest infection is going to sound on screen. And I think a really good example of that is in episode 3 when Ellie sees somebody infected in the basement and they're sort of just sort of struggling to breathe. And
yeah, you really get a sense of that there.
Exactly, and it's kind of funny to hear that there's someone sitting there curating that sound to make sure that it doesn't sound like this person sounds off, that actually it sounds like this person who's performing this, that it sounds correct, that they're breathing like that.
Right. Yeah, that was a fun little moment too, where we decided on the stage actually. So maybe this is a moment where you can feel the evolution from a runner to a clicker type of thing. So we tried to almost like even with like the you know the lung infected breathing, and kind of give like the also like the vocal fryness of a clicker in there as well. So it's like you can almost feel like the evolution and how they turn. So it was just like kind of painting little nods at things in those situations where it's like quiet and really focused. And I thought that was a lot of fun to do too.
Yeah, I think like that's the other part about it too, is like in the game, you have really, and it's a gameplay mechanic, you have certain kind of infected that are meant to attack you in normal ways. Then you have the clickers, which and everything's really separate. But with having those things blend, I mean, it makes it so much like to ground it in reality. I mean, Chris, you had to work really, I know how much work you put into making that actually work. Like, and to for it to be believable that this is an in-between state between these, which would normally just be an enemy type.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the reality of it. I mean, it's just like to make it feel like this is a real thing that is a threat, could attack Ellie in that basement. I think it's but just like feeling that reality and how grounded this is, so that as an audience member you buy into whatever's on screen and aren't thinking about it, that you're just buying into the story in that moment.
Right.
Because the show has pre-existing source material, how do you go about creating your own version? Does having like a previous source material to refer to hinder that, or with it being different mediums, it doesn't really matter that much?
I think for something like this, like you have to listen to the source material and honor that IP, just because, like what Chris said, the fans know the sound. But it was like I got a lot of help with Phil Kovacs, who was one of the audio leads on the first one. And he would come into my studio at Warner and just kind of give me like the blessing and the green light of like, yep, this is it. This is correct. And maybe like even give me notes about like, oh, maybe like in episode 2 in the museum, he would kind of give me direction on like, oh, this clicker would bark out some clicks to feel the room here or there, and just kind of like put a bit more story on what they're doing. That was a huge help. The story behind the clickers, that was the first scene I did, was the museum scene, and I just did it myself. I used my voice, and it's like, oh, I can do vocal fries, and I can kind of try to reverse engineer that. And I did it to the best of my ability. But the truth of it is the Misty Lee and Phil Kovacs, who were the original clickers in the game, at this point, like their voices are so recognizable if you played the game. And do my best. And I did, I slugged all my stuff in, and I showed Craig, and he's like, no, this isn't right. And try again. And finally I was like, we have to get the people that did the voices. I think that's just the missing element. And so then we set up an ADR day where they came in, and we just recorded a ton of stuff. And the first time, Phil did his like iconic, and everyone was like, oh, that's it. So then we just recorded a ton of that stuff, and using that as a source material, it felt like the game, but I had way more flexibility on how I wanted to use it, and as opposed to just like the video game engine stuff, which was pretty hard to use on screen. So having that support from the original sound designers and the voice characters was like huge for me to make sure I nailed that. So couldn't have done it without them.
Yeah, we had a lot of support from the game team, actually, although we didn't actually use any of their source, which was the big thing. Was Chris spoke with Phil a lot, and then I had two people, Bo Jimenez and Jesse Garcia, who guided me on a lot of stuff, and really trying to. I think it's just like even if we're not using the original sounds, we're translating them as closely as we can to screen. Mm-hmm. Chris Terhune had the clickers and the bloater and all the infected. But even like the infected scanner is matched all the way to the pitch, like to make sure it's as perfect as it can, but also just so they can do the new things that we need them to do on screen that didn't necessarily happen or weren't as given as much prominence as in the game. So I think it was just like the big thing that I think both of us felt was we really wanted to do it justice, and we really wanted to just honor it while translating it and making it as engaging as possible for this new audience.
Yeah, because I can imagine that if you have that source, it would be quite easy just to sort of go to the well quite often, and it's like the meme, you can copy me, just change it a bit. and that's what I can imagine would be quite tempting to do, but because there's a lot more to it, I think you kind of want to build up your own world with it and put your own touch to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Like Because the game engine, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, the game engine actually was the thing that produced the random different sounds. It would take in a bunch of different clicks and vocal performances, just like a handful of that, but it would also then produce, all the stuff in the game that we just didn't have access to.
Yeah,
So
from what I it's like, yeah, a lot of the stuff and the material and the sounds in the game are all engine and procedurally generated. So they're not even really prepared to be translated to the screen or be edited in the way that we would need for film and TV, And it's in this one, it's obviously TV, but I feel like it's so cinematic. And some of these episodes are so long too. We treated everyone as detailed and as important as if it was a movie. Trying to actually pull material from the game is just really, really difficult because they're not set up to be pulled for that kind of thing. It's meant to be played. And so like, yeah, I mean, you having to hand edit, mouth clicks and for the clickers and the vocals and the screeches is a little different than a game scripting out what the rhythms could possibly be.
yeah, because in beat for beat in a show too, like those clicks, yeah, for a clicker just to just kind of have random clicks out in a game, but as opposed to a television show, it's like when Joel's hiding down the hall and he's trying to quietly load his gun, and that one down the hall, it's just it's got very specific clicks that you kind of have to control. And on the stage, like Craig would literally be like, oh, just one more, oh, just maybe just a half a second later or half a second earlier, maybe just get rid of that first. You have to have all that. You have to have control over all that. So no, yeah, that's kind of that was the big key of it, is just having the control over the material. And so yeah, to reverse engineer everything that they thought of how to make in a matter of a few weeks was definitely a huge challenge, but I'm pretty stoked on the outcome.
I think we're also both just really happy with how the fans have responded to that kind of stuff. The best compliment you can get is that the sound from the game? And it's like, yeah, like, no, that's the best compliment that I think Chris can get. It's like that fans, it's so close that it's people are unsure of exactly where it came from is just awesome.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
That's the best compliment you can get. Is that from the game? It's like, no, that's all my hard work. But it's also interesting point that you made is the clicker sound being just add the extra second there, or just to add a little bit more there, because it sounds like you could have a lot of fun with that clicker sound, but the clicker sound also is like, well, if we just sprinkle a tad bit more here, you're sprinkling more tension into the scene, and just sort of build up to what's happening on screen.
Right. Or just taking out clicks, right? That was even, especially in the museum, with that space down the hall, and be able to play with the verb, just being able to okay, I think it'd be scarier for you just hear as opposed to just in it, and how it excites the space is kind of what makes it even creepier.
Yeah, you totally just touched on the thing that I was going to say was it's actually the quiet sometimes is way more tense, and all of those little tiny floor creaks and the scuffs of their shoes and their movement and Joel and Ellie and Tess's breathing and just feeling all of those tiny, tiny sounds where that if they make anything louder than, dust, that they're going to be attacked, which is what that little tiny glass break moment is, can add so much tension where if we filled it with cacophony and filled it with the clickers vocals, then sometimes that tension would get broken up. So yeah, muting those things out and really building in those silences, which aren't really silences, all those quiet sounds are just as important as the guns in those scenes to build tension.
Great. You just created a great segue to my next question, because what I wanted to focus on is that the show is filled with scenes that are full of tension, but also a lot of drama in them. Is there a difference in the way that you create the sound design for them? So some scenes that come to mind is the clicker scene in episode 2 in the museum, Bill and Frank's last meal scene in episode 3, and then also entering the infected in episode 5.
Big differences in terms of what the tension is or what the scene is. And I think it ultimately comes down to story, what's the important mood for these moments? Something like the truck into the chaos, into the plane crash, and then all of the aftermath of that in episode 1 has a big difference in the kind of tension than the clickers or the infected scene, the clicker scene in episode 2 or the infected scene in episode 5. I think that it's all about what we're trying to accomplish in those scenes. Like for talking about tension, the tension of Nana, which Chris could probably talk about, attacking the neighbors and then going after Sarah and then getting in the truck and going down and getting through the field and then going through the city and the city bursting into chaos, and then the plane falling out of the sky and exploding. It's very, very tense and a lot of momentum there. I think that's a totally different kind of tension than than the stuff that we had to do in the clicker scene, where it's quiet and it's that quiet silence of impending almost horror, from these infected.
Yeah, he's absolutely right.
That's what I quite like in the show, is the juxtaposition of both scenes, where the tension is a lot of silence that you mentioned before, and just adding in those creaks or those sounds where, like yourself, when it has been silent, you kind of look over your shoulder a bit more to think, did I hear something correctly?
Oh, completely.
Is there something there?
We definitely worked in we tried to sprinkle some what is that what I thought it was type of moments, like doors or whatever, just to kind of give little nods of maybe what's ahead or maybe not ahead, and that was fun.
Yeah, building those little tiny moments of putting people on edge and then pulling them back and then pushing them back in the world. I think it's one of the difficult things in designing this show, is that there's so many quiet moments that are really supposed to be beautiful and don't have tension, where it's Joel and Ellie just walking through the woods or walking down the fields, or, Bill and Frank in their strawberries, or in this latest episode in the mall. There's really moments of beauty and a personal connection of these stories and these characters, and trying to create those kinds of quiet versus the kinds of horror quiet of Ellie in the basement or them in the tunnels where you think there might be infected, or
but also with those Joel and Ellie walking through the woods or the mall or whatever those spaces are. I think with the way the show was filmed and the drama it's created and the tension is created, it's you can there's almost horror within the piece too, which oh man, everyone just feels too safe, so it's shit can just go down at any moment. And I think that's what's so great about that. You can have half hour of nothing that really happens, but there's still a bit of tension there just because of the world that these filmmakers have built. And that also helps us, is again, yeah, that quietness is peaceful, but something can just happen, like the mall, for instance. So that's a lot of fun for me in that show. It's just, you just never know. Even if you play the game, you can kind of oh, I know it's going to go down and there's spoilers, but there's it's just twisted enough where it's going to happen, but it happens a bit differently, but the same, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, that things are going to happen. And I think that that those tensions often pay off but sometimes in unexpected ways, like with Bill and Frank, where you're like, Bill, why are you letting this guy in your house? You don't know him. But then it ends up being just a beautiful love story, And sometimes I think it's one of the best parts about this show is the tension doesn't always release in the way that you expect it to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think having those mixture of those scenes. So as you said, the allowing, even with the Bill and Frank, allowing someone into your house or even just opening them up into your life completely changes that. But then also, as you're mentioning, the whole mall sequence, because on screen it feels very much quite a wholesome moment for someone to discover all of it, a past life effectively, and having everything frozen in time, and then also being introduced to the game Mortal Kombat, which I'm curious about, is that because you have those certain things that are related to real life. So, for example, a Mortal Kombat game, do you create the sound design for that, or do you get the licensing rights instead to be inserted to the game into the show?
Adamant about using the original source material from Mortal Kombat, just because he just he's obviously such a fan of that game too. He was nerding out about it, but yeah, we got all the licensing, I think, for that game and some other games too, right, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I like some of the stuff that was on screen for that arcade. We had to be pretty diligent and make sure that everything got licensed.
Mhm.
because otherwise we're trying to recreate something that's signature and classic and iconic, and like
Like that gong when it first starts was like such a big
yeah,
deal.
such a big deal to make sure that we felt like the bass and the power of that machine turning on as you put on those coins, and and making sure that when they flip those breakers and you get into that arcade, that you feel like you're in that arcade with all of the games going off. Everything's exciting and new, and like
Yeah.
it's a story point for Ellie to be just amazed by this thing that should never be around. And this also goes down to that grounded and real across everything. If we just start recreating sounds that everybody already knows, it's like, well, we want to make sure that people really buy into this as being a real person and story, and into like this being a real world, and not like a Hollywood cinematic thing. And so we were pretty diligent in making sure that those sounds were right.
Right. And it just feels, I think, as a viewer, it feels more satisfying just because like you feel more connected with it, just because it's like they're experiencing what I've experienced, and not in a level of like the end of the world, but like, just as simple as like your first time playing Mortal Kombat, like how awesome that was. So
Yeah, 100%. It brought me back memories of probably being a bit too young playing that game on Sega Mega Drive.
Mhm.
But
Pulling people's skeletons out through their like heads. Yeah, it's awesome.
So fun.
and I know I can't believe I was allowed to play that. That my parents allowed that. I don't think they were aware of just how violent it actually was. I think you touched on this earlier about the sort of in episode one where when you start getting introduced to infected, and how it's quite chaotic once the outbreak happens. But you can tell, the show does jump between various time periods, and at some point the world in 2003 is very chaotic and loud, but when you get to the modern day, it's very still. In a way, like the world feels like it's healing itself from what's happening, even though there are people who are infected. Was this a creative decision from the start, or was this just something that happened along the way?
I think with the world, it's the original part, it's really populated. It's Austin, Texas. It's a city. It's an everyday 2003 cars, school, just normal life. And I think that it's a pretty deliberate decision sonically to like start with that kind of world where it just feels like an everyday, like a real place, like a city. As we've jumped forward, the population is so thinned. The world has collapsed. And so that quiet and the nature, and in the QZ, just like the quarantine zone in that area, like the lack of technology and the lack of resources that these people have. I mean, it was pretty intentional. I think one of the most difficult things in designing this show is that a lot of shows have set locations. You're in one place, and then and then you have other characters in another place, and it's pretty typical of television, I think, to have these multiple storylines going on in these multiple places. And so you get to really reuse those kinds of ambiances, and revisit those spots. And this show, it's really was really hard because it was abandoned world. You can't use traffic, you can't use planes, there's not any people, so it's all whatever's around that environment. And it's a road trip TV show essentially. They're starting in like quarantine zone Boston, and then they go to abandoned Boston, and then they're in Kansas City, and or in the forests, and then they're in Kansas City and those buildings, and now the mall and Cheyenne and Wyoming. But all it has to feel abandoned. It all has to feel destroyed. It all has to feel quiet, and like they're in this world that they're really isolated, and every place they visit hasn't been kept up and is rusty and creaky. And so it's one of the most difficult things about this show, was trying and deliberately designing all these environments to try to tell the story of the place, and of what's gone on.
When you do listen to the various soundscapes of it all, I think it's the idea of having everything so still. And I know I mentioned before having the idea of like always trying to have eyes at the back of your head to make sure that nothing's there. But there's always, in terms of like jumping from various places to places, so going from the QZ to an abandoned Boston, where in sort of episode 2 you walk in through the flooded hotel, and also having Kansas City, where it's basically an outlaw town run by the rebels that has a different kind of stillness to it, where you have that feeling of like something is definitely not right, and it's not the infected, as we find out when Joel and Ellie are ambushed.
Right.
I guess presented in various ways in terms of not just the soundscape, but also visually.
Yeah, we have to give huge credits to those teams. I mean, they gave us such a playground in terms of, and such good world building and direction visually, and the picture editorial and how it's shot and just how it's written, production design. It's also like gorgeous and so well put together that it was really inspiring in terms of putting that world together and trying to like, oh, they did such a good job. We need to make sure we're stepping it up and putting it in just as much work to make this as like sonically gorgeous or sonically intense as they're doing visually.
Yeah, I mean, something like that. It's just when you have filmmakers that know what they want and everyone just is on the same page with everything, it just makes it such a fun experience. And you don't have to like guess. Like when you watch, a scene, like it tells you what it wants. And that, that makes our work that much not easier, but like it's just it makes our instincts kind of really kick in, and we can tell like what this scene needs to sound like or that scene needs to sound like because of the filmmaking is just so great. There's just no question about it. And just because Craig Mazin along the way just like was really like vocal about everything he wanted to, and so it was really cool to collaborate with him on all that. And it's just everyone was just on the same page and firing all cylinders, and that was pretty amazing.
Because this show has multiple directors and creatives working at the same time, like who do you I would understand that you report to sort of Craig when sound designing, but how does working with so many different people affect the way that you work and what you want to create? Or is it a case of the directors have a brief that they want you to follow and then Craig signs off on it? Or is it a case that Craig oversees everything?
It's more of the case that Craig oversees everything. The only other director we really engaged with Neil, and I think he directed episode 2, and he was pretty involved with that episode, and he came to the stage a lot, and he gave us notes, and he was involved in some of the ADR sessions, like when we were doing the clicker stuff. But it was pretty much all on Craig to really kind of give everybody the last green light on how this needs to sound. And Chris and I are we like to make fun big sounds, and we're both pretty good at it, and Craig would have to like kind of rein us in a lot too, right? Like he had to remind us like, hey man, like this is a show that should feel real, and even though we would like tone it down, he'd be like, it still needs to get more toned down. And there are moments where Chris would be like, ugh, okay, and then you'd watch it and you'd be like, man, he's right. Like, because you can get caught up in a moment or a scene and you wanted to make it exciting and sonically fun, and it is all fun when it's real, but like he sees the big scope of how all the episodes connect, so having that guidance was just key on that.
Yeah, or moments that we were playing as unimportant that were really important, or because of his whole vision, or moments that we were playing as very important that we should have just let pass by. Having that kind of direction was really important. Neil was super great too. Yeah, he's the one who created the game and is one of the heads of Naughty Dog, the game studio. So to actually be around him was awesome, because we were like, oh, this is so cool. Like you made the game that we love, that we're working like it was like cool to see him direct these episodes, or direct like, I think it was one episode, but he was around for some playbacks and would pop in occasionally to just check in on things. And
yeah,
sorry, go ahead. His and Craig's relationship was really cool too, because they were super collaborative. And so it was like, everybody seemed to really just love this story and just wanted to make it as good as we can.
And it was cool to see Craig. Like, I always wanted to work with Craig since I saw Chernobyl, so getting to be a part of this was pretty rad. And just seeing Craig be like kind of like a fanboy to Neil, because he was that dude obviously loves the game, and to just kind of like see him and Neil interact, it was pretty fun. And just to see a fan just like meet like someone that created something he loves so much and being able to like turn that into a show. And but one of my favorite moments was when Neil came back for the playback of episode 2, and when we got through the clicker scene, like he gave me like one note on something, and I was just like, no way. Like, okay, cool. All right. If he says it's cool, then I guess we nailed it. So that was a big moment for me to like, when I could be like, take a deep breath and like, okay, cool. I got this. It's fine. Like if I can get the clickers approved, then cool. Then I'm not going to worry that much. But through the rest of the process, it was still like always like, I hope I did this right, you know? So I'd always hit up Chris and I would call each other at like 11 o'clock or midnight sometimes, just kind of like, man, did we really like do this right or whatever. And so I think it harks back to like everyone was just so invested on making this show right for the fans, and even up to the showrunner. So, you know, everyone was on the same page on that. So that was really cool.
I think as well, having someone who created the original source material come on board and just be like, I wonder what their reaction must have been like seeing everything that's created basically in real life rather than as a video game. That being like the sets, the sort of sound design, and the visuals. Because I know as it's like a different medium, you don't want it to be a carbon copy, but how weird must that be that you had all these ideas in your head and then other people have brought it to life, and you could kind of like walk, hear, smell, and feel what you've created.
Completely.
Yeah, you could literally go touch a clicker.
Yeah, I mean, he talked about that. Like he'd come on the stage, or we'd have conversations, and like as professional as he was, he would still like just kind of be in awe of the whole thing. Like, yeah, it's like it's now become this tangible thing that he created. And I think he always felt so humble about it and excited and a fan of himself. So it's just cool to be around those people that just love that world, and getting to watch him see it come to life was pretty rad, because he talked about it all the time. Like he had all these stories from set, and the first time I saw a clicker, and he was like terrified, but like, oh man, this is awesome. Like I can't imagine what that feels like.
Do you think he would be like scared of their own clickers? So he's like, oh, I was so scared of my own creation, and then that first day he walks on set, he just bumps into it. He's just like, that whole fear comes over him again.
Yeah, right.
I bet it's all of the hours put in of how to design them, all the flashbacks.
Well, I think I saw a picture a few weeks ago where it was like behind the scenes of episode 2, where he's directing the museum scene. And there's a photo of him like directing a clicker, and the clicker's like has his makeup on and stuff, but his hands are kind of on his like hips and just like listening to the direction. It's just so funny to me. Yeah. And like, do you think he gives him the direction? All right, I want you to come around the corner like this, and he acknowledges by going, and then gets into his spot. But yeah, man, like good for him, dude. Like he created such a cool world. So it's cool to watch it become tangible, and it's always cool too. And then like he's a super sweet guy, and really cares, and super appreciative of all of us. So it's like being on the stage with him and having that little family. I mean, that's also why the show's so good, because everyone just cares about each other. And you know, when you have that environment, you know, everyone wants to do their best work.
Yeah, and I think this is a good moment to shout out the rest of our crew, who really put in a ton of time and effort, just as much as we did, who really care. Our supervisor, Michael Benavente, and Kevin Roach and Mark Fishman are re-recording mixers, and then Mitch Lessner, Jacob Flack, Matt Yoakum, and Odin Benitez are our sound effects editors, who all just were working as hard as they can to make this as good as we all wanted.
Now, I think as well on a show like this, it's the giving kudos to your crew as well, because there is without each other you can't create what you need. And also there's probably been those sort of, as you said, calling each other up at 11 or midnight, 11 at night or at midnight, sort of like, have we done this correctly, have we done that? But it also shows how much like dedication and how proud you are of your work to make sure that you guys can nail it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny you bring that up, and it's funny that Chris brought that up, because it sounds like an uncommon occurrence between us two when we were working on this thing. But it would be like a couple nights a week. It would be a midnight 1 a.m. call or text like, "Hey, are you working?" "Yeah, I'm working."
Yeah, I get a "you up" text from Chris.
And be like, "I can't figure out this moment. Do you have any recommendations?" And vice versa. It was really cool and collaborative, and it was
and like we also had a Dropbox too, where like we'd have like these like wacky ideas at any time, like, hey, try this, I'm sending you sounds, and vice versa. And so we'd create like this library of just like just cool stuff that we'd share with each other along the way. That was super helpful.
Yeah, and even hearing that, like, you up text sort of thing makes me chuckle. But that's also insane how much sort of work you guys had to be put into the project. I'm curious, what was your favorite scene or sound design to create?
Mine, I think mine was definitely the clickers, just because it was such a reverse engineering thing that I've never really had to do before. That's not true. I've had to do stuff like that before, but this was just different because it was a sound that was such an iconic sound based around very specific performances. So that having those two kind of like meld together, that was really hard to get. It's not just a sound of something, it's how it's performed, and then bringing that to a very specific scene. So all those kind of things was super challenging, but like being able to recreate that and getting the feedback it did, that definitely was probably my favorite.
Yeah, and those quiet and tension scenes are so difficult too. So, and I can't emphasize how much work Chris put in to make that right, because it was I'm really happy that fans and people seem to react so positively to it, and just like seem to love it as much as we do. I'd probably say for me it's the truck and the plane crash is the stuff that I was the most proud of if I was putting any sound scene. But honestly, there's also just so many moments of quiet that, like, or the abandoned buildings or that world, that people aren't thinking about. And so I'm also just really proud that so much of the world feels real to to audience members, because I think that was like so much work to make sure that everything felt right. If I had a big moment, it would I'm going to choose a big moment, a plane falling out of the sky and exploding. But those little moments were just as difficult, and I think are just as important.
Yeah, I think another one of mine too was the hotel lobby with the flood.
A frog buddy hopping on a little piano.
That was so fun. Just I felt like that was the first episode we both dove into, and I think we both spent the most time on. And there's just an incredible amount of detail in that episode, like there is through the rest of the show. But I think that was the one where you got to really kind of figure out the formula. So yeah, I was just being able to just like cut them just dragging themselves through the water and all the drips and that kind of environment that you don't ever hear was super fun. And it's just like it's not every day you get to create a world like that, so it's hard to pick. So that's why obviously it's a clicker for me, but there's just so many fun things that we got to do that I'm grateful for.
Yeah, if we started going scene by scene, we'd start nerding out about each individual scene.
Yeah, so exactly. Like the little things that we would do, or
I love this moment and this thing with the junk, right? This little thing. Like there's so much to talk about that, like, any specific scene you pick out, that we're gonna start nerding out about all of the sound work that went into it.
That's the important thing, right? Is that I think when you love your craft, there are moments you can nerd out completely, and I think that also kind of leaves who you're talking to in art of like your hard work, because there's so much that goes into it, and it's also like the love, attention, and dedication, just so that the end user, which is the viewer, has the best experience possible and does not get taken out of the show, but also is just sort of drawn even more in.
Yeah, totally. Robert, I'm curious, like, do you have scenes that stood out to you? I mean, you've brought up a couple scenes here or there, but like from a sound perspective, I'm curious what has affected you as a like an audience member.
So there are a couple. I think I've mentioned them already, but I think the idea of soundscapes between the two different time periods is something that is quite interesting to hear, in terms of having that chaoticness to then being still and having moments of sort of, is something there or not? But I think one of the biggest ones is probably the transition between, in episode 3, when you see the blanket and it transitions back to 2003, and you see people being rounded up, because it's the early days of the infection. People are being rounded up. You can hear the fear and people's murmuring and having the baby crying whilst Bill is watching on the monitor.
That was a really fun one to do. It was trying to make that as emotional as possible, seeing that blanket that you then find out pretty immediately was that woman with her baby who were both killed. It's heavy stuff. And so to try and transition that into a like a don't tread on me prepper, in his basement is a pretty difficult thing while still trying to hit that emotional beat. But I love that moment. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Because you know what the outcome is of what's happened with people. Joel's explaining that he's surround people up. I think it's, even though you know people's, as an audience member, you're ahead of the character, ahead of the characters that are being rounded up. I think that having that extra sort of dose of people in fear, but have that slight bit of hope as well, because they think, oh, we're being saved, but reality is they're not. I think another scene as well, I think in episode 6, I think the idea of when they're in the commune in Wyoming, I think it's when they're watching the film and having that sort of community experience as well. I think that's kind of a slightly different in terms of people are used to this life, but it's also being in a room with people who are rediscovering art. Well, not rediscovering, should I say, discovering art for the first time with movie nights, and kind of sitting there with the characters, if it's the leads or the background actors, and sort of like hearing the murmurs and being there whilst they're enjoying movie night. So I know it's very like a simple choice, but I think those are the sort of human moments in the show that you kind of feel and miss, that if this happened in real life, those
you totally see that happening, right?
Yeah, those collective experiences are stuff that we would miss. I think even in the pandemic that we had with COVID, it's like I didn't want to bring it up or have those or say about the similarities of them, but you do feel that you miss those collective moments together, like going to a football game together, going to a bar, or even just going to the movie theater to watch something.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's that community, and that it's such a contrast to Joel and Ellie being alone for so long, or their communities being the communities that are going after them, So it's like it's just such a beautiful story moment.
Yeah, and it's very, I think you just sort of, I think that's that moment you take back where you actually think that there are, even though there's people that are running from, there's also pockets of communities that are thriving and are sort of rebuilding and trying to get back to
Well, there's
being
hope,
in normal.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Having a hope as a society.
Yeah, there's hope in Ellie's story of being immune, and there's hope in these communities, and like every little, there was hope in the connection with Sam and Henry, and Bill, and Bill and Frank. I think it's even with society collapsing and seeing the very, very worst of people, there's also the best of them.
Yeah, exactly. Just to go to my last question, if, say, for example, the infected became real, what is one piece of sound equipment that you would take on your journey to survive in the sort of post-apocalyptic landscape?
One piece of sound equipment we would take to survive in a post-apocalyptic.
Probably a guitar. Just, and I'll be real, I'd probably die pretty fast.
That's true.
like, the survival skills for something like that are so specific, and I don't think I would be out pretty fast. So I'll take a guitar, and I'll get the infected's attention real fast.
Oh man, probably a. Oh man, I'll bring drums. We can start a band.
We're going to the top of a roof, and we're seeing what's happening. No,
Yeah,
I mean, in that situation, is like microphones aren't going to be that useful,
right? Yeah, you start to think about it, but it's like, but then when you said guitar, I'm like, man, if you break a string, dude, like.
Yeah, and I'll just hope. I mean, you could maybe take a record player, but you don't have
What are you gonna plug it into?
Yeah, I know, it's the problem. So it's like, I think it's just like, yeah, at that point, it's going full acoustic.
You can get one of those, maybe, what are they? The windy radios.
Or like they have those amps that you can, like, I don't know if they still make them, but you like clip them into your sort of like belt buckle. I think
yeah.
like maybe have something like that. I think they might be battery powered. I can't remember now.
You can play guitar.
Do I play? Yeah, I don't.
You
I
can play
don't
guitar
know.
on the little amp.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
know what you're talking about.
yeah, and you can have that
Do
with you.
walkie-talkies count?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think they do. They
Yeah,
create
yeah.
they create sound. I think that's the acceptable answer.
that's an actual real answer, but that, well, if the world collapsed that hard, I'd be dead.
Don't worry, I'd be right behind you. So, sort of, it is what it is.
I'm not gonna come find you guys. Jeez.
You're banging on drums. Nobody, people are gonna find you.
Everyone's gonna know where I'm at.
Christy, thank you very much for joining me today and talking about The Last of Us. The Last of Us is streaming now on HBO in America. Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Robert.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's been a blast.
No, it's been great. Thank you, and thank you so much. You guys both take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you as well. Bye.
Have a good one.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.